Hi friends, welcome to our third Facebook Live of the summer. I'm so glad that you have joined me tonight as we chat about guided reading. This is week 3 of a 4-part series on guided reading. So if you're joining me tonight for the first time, be sure to go back to the 2 previous weeks because I think you'll find lots of great value there in some of the sessions and the things that we talked about. Tonight we're going to be talking more about what is happening at the guided reading table. But before I get started, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Amanda and I blog at mrsrichardsonsclass.com. I taught kindergarten and first grade for several years before stepping out of the classroom and staying home with our 2 little ones. I now create teaching resources, and I'm passionate about all things balanced literacy, and I provide professional development on all aspects of balanced literacy. So if you're in Texas and you live in the DFW or the Houston area, come join me in the fall. We've got 4 sessions planned. That'll be fun. Okay, so let's recap the last 2 weeks of Facebook Live. So the first week, we talked about coming to the table. So we talked about everything that happens as you prepare for the kids to come to your table. We talked about preparing the kids, and I shared that blog freebie with you all. We talked about preparing yourself, and we also talked about preparing your materials. Then last week was our first week of talking about what happens at the table. So first we talked about, so last week we talked about what the table looks like when my students are there, what is happening at the table, and what is not happening at the table. We covered some common misconceptions that happen and that we all have about guided reading. And we also talked about what a 20-minute guided reading lesson looks like, and we just dug deeper into that a little bit. So tonight, let's get started, and we're going to talk more about all of the things that are happening at our guided reading table. We're going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about grouping your students, scheduling your groups, and we're going to talk about identifying your teaching point. I feel like tonight is jam-packed with lots of information. I have lots of notes, so I'm going to be referring to those because I don't want to leave anything out. There's lots of great things that I want us to talk about. Okay, so grouping your students. This is such an important piece of guided reading. And if I'm honest with you guys, for years, I only grouped my students by their guided reading levels. And what I mean by that is I only grouped level B readers with other level B readers, level D readers with other level D readers. Even if they were struggling, I just said, nope, you are a level D reader. I have done my assessment. I have the data to prove this. You need to stay here. And what I learned a couple years ago is that is not a best practice. I know, total teacher confession, girls, and guys, if there are guys in here. So here's what I learned the last few years in the classroom. While most of the time students are going to be grouped by levels, the groups are flexible in every single aspect possible. So like I said, I thought that I had flexible grouping going on. Yes, flexible grouping, guided reading, that's the best practice. And yes, I do that. My kids move in and out of groups from one group to another. I totally thought that that's exactly what I was doing, but I really wasn't embracing flexible grouping in the way that it is meant when it comes to guided reading. So what I've learned is that my kids can be grouped based on more than just their reading level. So let me explain, and I'm going to give you a little example. Sometimes you might have a group of level D readers who are doing wonderful, except for little Sam. Sam just seems to be stuck. He can decode perfectly, but he can't retell the story at all. And because you are a great guided reading teacher and you are monitoring both Sam's reading accuracy and his reading comprehension, like we talked about last week, you are going to exercise flexible grouping, and you're going to make a group with mixed reading levels, but that are still close to each other. So you might grab 2 students from a level C group and put them in a group with Sam and have a little group of 3. So Sam's a level D reader and these other 2 kids are a level C reader, but it's okay. They will all read a level C text and you're going to focus on retelling with this whole little group. It's not going to hurt Sam to read a text that's too easy for him, especially as you want decoding and fluency and the other aspects of reading to not be a struggle. You want the text to be simpler, which will happen when you move him down a level, and you want to really be able to focus on comprehension with him. So moving him down will allow for that. And you remember, you've also moved these other 2 students from level C out of their normal level C group and into a group that is focused on just comprehension, okay? So it might even be a level C book that you're using that the other students have already read, that those 2 level C students have already read, because then it's a familiar text to them. They're not going to struggle with decoding, and you're really going to be able to help them focus on the comprehension aspect. You could do the same thing again with fluency. Maybe a child is decoding and comprehending really well at her reading level, but her fluency really needs some work. So typically, I would move that student down so we can focus on her fluency more. You might also run into number issues when you're grouping your students. Sometimes there are just too many kids to fit into a group that's done just by reading level. Like I said, I was so guilty of doing. So what I mean by that is that maybe there are 7 kids in level C, and so you're going to have to find 2 kids to move around because we're not going to put more than 6 kids in a group. I didn't even like to have 6 kids in a group, but sometimes it just happened. But never, ever, ever more than 6 groups. That's like a non-negotiable that I had for myself in the class. More than 6 students in a group was totally a non-negotiable that I had for myself when it came to guided reading. So I would probably take 2 of those kids who are on level C, and I'm going to look at the other aspects. I'm going to look at the other things that they need to be working on and focusing on, and I'm going to move them around. I don't ever recall a time that I would move students up a level. The main reason is because when you move students up, most of the time it's just going to be frustrational for them. Unless for some reason they can decode that text, they're just going to be frustrated. So I always would move the kids down instead of moving them up. Monitor your students. You don't want a student to be frustrated because something's too hard, but you also don't want them to be bored because it's just way too easy. So if you have moved a student down a group, or if you have made this new group that has 2 or 3 different guided reading levels, probably not 3, probably only 2 different guided reading levels, what you're going to need to make sure is that they're not getting bored there. Because if they're getting bored there, then they're not going to be engaged. And so you need to make sure that you're keeping them engaged as you're focusing on those aspects as well. And give yourself grace. Know that you might mess up, and that's just totally okay. You might try this kid in a group, and it might just totally blow. Guys, if I'm honest, there were times when I tried a kid in a new group, and it was just like I could tell this kid was too frustrated. It just wasn't a good fit, and I would just say, you know what? Mrs. Richardson is just going to hold on to this book, and I want you to take home your other guided reading book, and you can read that one again tonight. And then at the end of the day, I would make those switches that I need to those groups. There's no sense in keeping that poor baby there if they are just too frustrated because they're not going to learn. So give yourself grace, know that you might mess up, and know that that's okay. We all do that. Remember that your groups are flexible. You can have a group that's working on a comprehension skill, a fluency skill, or an accuracy skill. Okay, so that's grouping your students. Okay, so let's talk now about scheduling your groups. This is a question that I got just this weekend. I got some good questions about scheduling groups, so I wanted to make sure that I touched on this and that we talked about this a little bit today. There are different ways that we can group our kids. And so when it comes to scheduling, there are also different ways that teachers schedule their groups and work their groups in their classrooms. And so I'm going to share with you what worked well for me and my classroom. I met with 3 groups a day. My goal was always to meet with 3 groups a day. So if you followed last week when we talked about our 20-minute guided reading lesson, you know that that would mean I need an hour of guided reading. And yes, my schedule always allotted for an hour of guided reading from the beginning. Now, the reality is that most of the time I did get to 3 groups, but not always. Things come up, things happen, and I'm not perfect, and there's not a perfect teacher. And so there would be days when I would only get to 2 groups, and that's okay. I would move my groups around, I would tweak my schedule a little bit, and we would roll with it. As I taught guided reading more and more, it got easier and easier to stick with the time. And so, like I shared a little bit last week, or maybe in the first week, I lived by a timer. That timer started, my timer went off, and there were times even in in the middle of my 20-minute lesson, I would set a 10-minute timer. So I would know, okay, I've used up half of my time. So 3 groups a day when scheduling your groups. The other thing that I suggest is to give yourself freedom. My kids never knew when they were coming to my table. Someone asked me last weekend, did your kids rotate through like they rotate through literacy stations? And we're going to dig more into literacy stations next week. But my answer is no. And my reason for that was because I moved them within their groups. I didn't want them to be grouped in their literacy station in the same way they might be grouped in their guided reading group. And things just constantly changed. So one day they might be in a level B group, and the next day they might have advanced to the level C group, and then it just messes everything up. So give yourself freedom when you're scheduling your groups. I would just call my kids to the table by saying, okay, today Mrs. Richardson wants to read with Sam, Joey, Barrett, Libby, and Kanan. And I would call them to my table that way. And then when it was time to switch groups, I would say, okay, now and I would name the new friends that I needed to come to my table. This just gave me the freedom to move kids around, to meet with them on various days. And they never were upset or disappointed. Because they were never in the exact same group all of the time, they never said to me, oh, well, I'm supposed to be in that group, or I always read with so-and-so. Because every week or two, it was like the groups were changing, that flexible grouping that we talked about. So give yourself freedom. I suggest not having a rotation be teacher table or guided reading table. Okay, here's an example of what my schedule looked like in my classroom. So this is if I had 5 guided reading groups. So on Monday, I would meet with a low group, a low medium group, and then my high group. On Tuesday, I would meet with my medium group, my medium high group, and then that low group again. On Wednesday, I would meet with my low medium group, my lowest group, and then my highest group again. So I've now hit my high group twice and my low group 3 days, every single day. On Thursday, I meet with that medium group, my medium high group, and then my low group again. On Friday, I would meet with my low group, my low medium group, and then my medium group. That might have been a lot to keep up with. So on my blog, I have a post that I can share with you all. There is a free planning sheet for mapping out your groups. And there's also my example schedule in that freebie. Okay, so when we're done, I'll post a link at the top of the Facebook Live post, so you guys can grab that. I wanted to point out that my low group I meet with every single day. Again, non-negotiable for me with guided reading. My high group I meet with 2 days a week. And my high group were always my students who were reading way above level, way above our grade level expectation at that time of the year. And then my medium and my medium high group, I met with 3 days a week. There are times when I would drop a group or when I would not get to meet with a group. I would typically let go of one of the low group sessions because they were meeting with me the most times. Every single day I was seeing those babies. So I would let that group go first because I knew for sure that I was going to see them the other 4 days of the week. Okay, so we've talked about grouping our students. We've talked about scheduling those groups. I want to now dig into identifying your teaching point. I feel like this is really part of that 20-minute guided reading lesson. But it is such a valuable part of that 20-minute guided reading lesson, so I don't want to leave it out. So it seems so small, right? Because when you're looking at the whole guided reading lesson, it literally is 1 to 2 minutes of your 20-minute lesson with your kids. But here are some things to remember when we are identifying our teaching point. So like we talked about last week, guided reading is the time that you are coaching your students. So you aren't doing the work for them, but you're watching, you're observing, you're listening to them read, and then you're coaching them through reading. Your teaching point is only 1 to 2 minutes in length. And you can't pre-plan your teaching point. We are all teachers, and many of us like to plan things out. We like to know how our day is going to go, know how our schedule is going to work. But your teaching point is something that happens in the moment in your guided reading group. So as a teacher, this can sometimes be a super stressful time. Many of us like to plan things out, but you just can't plan out this detail. You identify the teaching point when you're listening to them read. So you might be taking a running record or at least taking anecdotal notes, but you are listening to the child read. And so this is going to be closer to the end of your guided reading lesson. Also remember that teaching points are always new skills. It's not something that you're just reminding the student of, that you're not just like for 2 seconds pointing out. It is something that you are able to identify them struggling with. You take it and then you make a short little 1 or 2 minute teaching point out of. And the teaching point will usually be specific to one child. So there are times when the teaching point applies to more than one child. So that might look like me listening to Sam and taking a running record on him and identifying, oh, he's really struggling with this. And then I also jump over here and listen to Joey read, and then Joey is really struggling with the exact same thing as Sam. And so I'm going to do a teaching point for both of them. Whereas most of the time the teaching point is just for one child, when that happens, I just tell my other kids, okay, keep reading this book quietly in your whisper voice. And when I do that, my kids know that when they come to my table, I've already set that expectation. So they know that as they're reading at my table, they're going to read that book at least 3 times in their whisper voice. Sometimes I need them to read it one other time if it's a super short book and I need to do a little bit more work on a teaching point with a student. But most of the times, 3 times works great for us. Okay, so let's talk through an example of what a teaching point might look like. So you would listen to the child read. You're going to note the miscue or the mistake with silent E words as they're reading. Then you're going to give a short explanation. After the child's reading, you're going to give a short explanation of the phonics rule, and you're going to teach them how we read silent E words. Then you might go through the book and find all the words that have silent E's in them. You might give the child highlight tape and let them highlight them. And then you will praise the child. Great job reading silent E words. Now, as you reread this story, I want you to make sure that you follow our phonics rule as you're reading the silent E words. And then you move on. It is literally that quick. So you might listen to that child again read the book to make sure they're getting it, or you might move on and do a running record or just take anecdotal notes on the other students that are in your group as well. Okay, so there are 4 types of teaching points. I feel like this is a lot of information. So there are 4 main types of teaching points: self-monitoring, decoding, fluency, and comprehension. I feel like it's getting dark in here. Hold on. Okay, that's a little bit better. Sorry, I look a little yellow now, guys. Okay, so self-monitoring. This is a teaching point that we usually have for our early readers. Sometimes it might be beyond our early readers, but always for those early readers, which is levels A through D, we are going to have this teaching point, self-monitoring. This is when we are teaching them how to be self-aware of all of these concepts about print that we are essentially hitting on and teaching during our shared reading time, and that we're modeling possibly during our interactive read-alouds. But this is when we are teaching self-monitoring, we are teaching them how to be self-aware of these basic concepts about print. We're also teaching them how to be aware of more than just the meaning, the structure, or the visual aspects of words. So the second type of teaching point you might have is a decoding teaching point. So this is easily identified as you are listening to your students read. You might have, this is commonly, most of the times when you might see an M, S, or V on your running record form. So M is for meaning, S is for syntax or text structure, and V is for visual. Those are the three things. Those three fall under the umbrella of a decoding teaching point. So meaning is when they make a mistake based on the meaning of the word that they're anticipating. So it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. The meaning of the sentence is the same. Therefore, they don't normally notice that they've made the error, but the word was still read incorrectly. So an example would be if the text said, "The girl went to the pet shop," instead of reading, "The girl went to the pet store." Pet store, pet shop, the meaning is still the same, but they were anticipating it being pet shop, therefore they read it that way when the word really was, when the sentence really said pet store, okay? So they also might, another teaching point that falls under decoding would be syntax or text structure. So this is when they make a mistake and it affects the meaning of the text. It no longer sounds right. So whereas when they make an error with meaning, it sounds right. They just keep breezing on through. It didn't change the meaning of the sentence. It still means the same thing. But when they make an error based on syntax or text structure, then it no longer sounds right. And sometimes, a lot of the times too, I should say, kids will self-correct those syntax errors because they hear that it doesn't sound right. But when they're not self-correcting those, then that's when we have a teaching point based on that. So an example would be if the text said, if the child reads, "Sam sit in the chair," instead of reading it, "Sam sits in the chair." Okay, so you don't say Sam sit in the chair. You say Sam sits in the chair. So they didn't read through the entire word. They only read some of the word, and they made an error based on the syntax or the text structure. It didn't sound right anymore. So the third teaching point that's under decoding would be a visual error that they might make. So this mistake is something that's based on the way the word looks. Visual, that should be easy enough. So an example would be that the child reads the line like this: "Jet likes to push with the car," instead of reading "Jet likes to play with the car." So the reader may have looked at the book, looked at the picture in the story, and seen a little boy pushing a car across a rug. So he was reading the word, saw the letter P, and instead of reading the word played, like the text said, instead he read pushed. Well, it matched the picture. However, that's a visual error. He saw the letter P and he just assumed, oh, well, it's pushed because that matches the picture. So that would be an example of a visual error that they would make, which falls under the umbrella of decoding. Okay, so we have self-monitoring teaching points, decoding teaching points, and then under decoding, we have meaning, syntax, and visual. I feel like you guys need like a table or something with that lays this out. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to be as explicit as possible. Okay, so another teaching point that you might make is based on fluency. So this is usually super easy to identify because all you're doing is listening and you're like, oh gosh, we are just running those period stop signs left and right. Like we are not paying attention at all to fluency. So a student might be struggling with phrasing. They might be reading very choppy and you might need to have a teaching point where you talk about how when readers read, we sound like we're talking on the phone. We don't sound like we're on a roller coaster. We don't sound like a robot. We just talk normal, like we talk when we talk on the phone. Or you might have a teaching lesson You might have a teaching point based on them using their correct expression and attending to punctuation or reading with voice inflection. Okay, so those are all teaching points that would be under the umbrella of fluency. So then the fourth teaching point you might have, we have self-monitoring, decoding, fluency, comprehension. That would be the last one, comprehension. So this might be the most common teaching point that we gravitate towards because it's so natural as a teacher to say, tell me more. I think that's like a phrase that I learned in college, and it's so easy to get a child to expand on something by saying, tell me more, tell me more. But this teaching point is identified after the child has read a book and you're asking them questions or you're prompting them to retell using a specific framework and they can't. I always did this orally during my guided reading groups. And I mentioned this a little bit last week. I very, very rarely did any sort of recording sheet or worksheet during my guided reading groups. So focusing on having a teaching point based around the concept of comprehension always was done orally for me. I shouldn't say always, I should say most of the time. Sometimes as we got up to the end of first grade, I would have them write on dry erase boards, but most of the time it was all done orally. Okay, I feel like that was so much when it came to teaching points. I want to share with you this quick freebie that I wanted to mention last week and just totally forgot. It is free for my email subscribers. So if you're not on my email list, you might want to be sure and hop on there. They're guided reading resource cards, and I'm going to show them to you. And they are leveled by reading levels. They're a great guide as you're working with each group. So this one is for word work, and I just cut them all out and put them on a ring. And then inside, I'm sorry, this is backwards, friends. They have different things that you're going to work on for each reading level. So level A and B, level C, level D, and goes all the way through level Q. Okay. So there's a word work one. There's a comprehension strategies and fluency one, which would be great too as you are planning out your lessons. Not that teaching point though, you can't pre-plan for it. And then behaviors to support is another one. And again, they are for each reading level in all of them. So these are a freebie for my newsletter subscribers. You just sign up and then boom, you will get right to the page. It's easy peasy. I am happy to post that link above as well. So I will post the link to the blog post that had the scheduling freebie. I also have a blog post that talks about teaching points. And so it kind of breaks down again those three pieces, the meaning, syntax or text structure, and visual aspects of the decoding teaching point. So that would probably be very helpful for you guys to have as reference if you weren't able to jot things down as we were chatting tonight. I feel like we covered so much tonight. Thank y'all so much for sticking around. I will link those blog posts above, and you guys have asked some questions, and so I was going to scroll up real quick and see if I could answer those. And what I can't get answered, I will hang around for sure tonight and answer those. So what assessments do you use to create your groups to start the year out? Amy, good question. Okay, so most of the time, and I think I touched on this a little bit last week, but let me explain a little bit more. Most of the time, I've worked in 3 different schools in 3 different districts, and most of the time they had leveling assessment kits. So in one school, we used the DRA kit, and in another school, we used the Rigby kit. I know Fountas and Pinnell have a kit. I've never had the privilege of using it. I've heard fabulous things about it. So those are kits that our school has purchased for us and that we used most of the time district-wide. At my last school, there was one DRA kit for the entire school, and I used it. And then my second year there, I created my own assessment kit using our basal adoption series. So what I did was I copied 2 leveled readers on each level and then I took a running record. So if they didn't have questions already planned for me to go with that leveled reader, then I made them myself. And then that book and that leveled reader was used only for assessment purposes because I wanted it to be a true cold read and a true first time of the student seeing that book. So sometimes my schools had assessment kits and sometimes they didn't. And if they didn't have them, I created my own. You also could do the same with Reading A to Z if you have a subscription to Reading A to Z. I know also at my last school, my principal bought that for all of us because it was cheaper than her buying leveled assessment kits for everyone. I don't know what they have now because it's been a few years that I've been out of the classroom, but if you don't have one, then you can totally make your own and make it work that way. Okay, let's see. Y'all have asked some good questions. Okay. I'm sorry your notes were messy, Emily. Thanks so much for hanging around. Good job. Yes, a teaching point reference chart. No, Nicole, that is a great idea. I will probably go back to my teaching point blog post and I can work on adding that. I will add it to my to-do list for sure. Okay, what reading level do you expect your first graders to be on at the end of the year? J. J was our grade level expectation for the end of the year. And of course, I always would have loved for them to have been 2 levels above because as research shows, most students lose 2 reading levels during the year. Okay, Lee, no, my guided reading units don't have assessments. They do not have assessments currently. That is something that I've toyed with playing. I've played around with adding to the kits, but I want to first complete all of the components to those guided reading lessons and units that I have available. Okay, so thanks again so much for joining me tonight. Next week, we're going to be talking about what happens beyond the table. So we're going to be talking both about parent involvement and we're going to be talking about what the other students are doing while they are not at the table. I've been getting lots of questions about literacy stations. So if you have any more specific questions, feel free to shoot me an email or shoot me a message here on Facebook. I am happy to help you and us just figure things out together. We are lifelong learners. And so I am happy to help you with that and send you any suggestions that I might have. So I hope you all have a great night and I hope you had a wonderful 4th of July and I'll see you soon. Bye.